So I want to talk a little bit about the specific experience that my students had when the pandemic started, because we were in a unique situation, being that we were in a service learning class which required 15 hours of community work for students. And it was an introduction to women's studies class. So it can be a variety of things because, you know, we talk about women, race, class, and, you know, intersectionality. And so there are many ways that students do service learning in my class. So I had maybe 35 to 40 students engaged in service learning activities. And then, you know, the pandemic comes along, everything shuts down, we can't leave, and everybody's panicking, and I'm panicking because I have to panic for myself and panic for all of my students. And, you know, with the kindergartner doing e-learning, you know, that was a whole adventure in itself. So it was a challenge, and I'm so grateful that I have already been teaching online and doing this online for a long time, because I feel that I was well prepared for this moment, just in that I've been teaching online and doing all of this for so long. But I know a lot of my colleagues were not feeling as confident, and so that's why, part of why I wanted to create this presentation, so that they do feel more confident moving forward. But I had to pivot for them, you know, who were at different stages. Some students, you know, I've got my stragglers, they had not started. Maybe they submitted a proposal, but they hadn't started yet. So they were in a different position than my students who really hit the ground running and were already at the shelter volunteering, and now it's closed. So I allowed some of them to change, projects. I allowed some of them to modify existing projects. I did a lot of different things with different students. At the end, some students did not even finish their projects, and some students had great success. So, I'm going to share some of those with you. And both were okay during that semester, because I respected the fact that we were in this situation, and it was very challenging on so many levels for students. And so in that class, I had a lot of other measures of, for evaluating their knowledge and whatnot in the class. So I was able to, let this count less for some students if it wasn't working out for various reasons. So flexibility is very important during a pandemic, as you have all learned the hard way. So what was really interesting about this time was that at the same time, access to volunteering and things like that were decreasing, the community needs were increasing, because people were now in this dire situation. Some were losing jobs, some did not have childcare, some, all of these situations that we were experiencing. So need was rising, but ability to do things, kind of felt like it was falling. So this was the problem that I felt we were trying to come up with solutions for, was how to complete projects from home, how to complete projects safely, but still how to serve these communities and these community needs. So, and then of course I already spoke to, realizing how everybody was going through this pandemic, and a lot of things, students, the top of their list was not this service learning project as it was. And so I didn't want to create more work. But I had some great examples of people adapting creatively, and for the majority, they came up with these projects themselves. Often I was just encouraging them, but almost all of my students came up with their own projects to begin with. I do provide a list of opportunities, but post-pandemic, almost all of them adapted their own projects. So one student was already engaged in on-site work at the Coalition for the Homeless, and then she decided she had to get to Sweden because she wanted to get home to Sweden before everything happened with lockdown, and things were happening differently in Sweden. So she was forced to go home pretty rapidly. And instead of completing anything with the Coalition, because she was now out of the country, she found another organization in Sweden called Human Bridge, and crocheted blankets for them because they assist low-income pregnant women. And so I have photos of that. And then I had a student who was doing on-site work at Feeding Children Everywhere, and he learned to sew, which was so impressive because I still don't know how to sew. I would like to learn, but I haven't. So he took that initiative, learned to sew masks to donate with scrap material. Now I had another student who was doing on-site work site work at the Women's Resource Center, and she conducted a food drive for them. So this was the student who was working at the coalition. Oh, look, you know, this is how my students in online classes show me what they're doing, basically. They share photos and, you know, screenshots and whatnot. So, and then here's in Sweden knitting her blanket. You know, it's just very cool to see this can happen anywhere, just, you know, through creative means. And so she was able to make several of these, and this was my student who created his masks. He had to try it on, you know, show me, this is my mask. But he talked about his process, you know, and it's interesting because in an Intro to Women's Studies class, you know, crafting and sewing has a history with, you know, women and femininity, and, you know, this is something that's been relegated to women for so long. And so it's kind of interesting to use something like this for change. And so I love crafting for change. I think it's great when students use their skills and things they like to do, you know, to say make pillowcases for domestic violence victims. You know, they get pillows, but maybe they want their own pillowcase, something that's theirs. I've had people make blankets for, you know, women's recovery centers up north because she was from New York and wanted to stay connected to her community. This student, because of the changes of what was happening with the travel industry, they were calling hotels and asking about, you know, donating some of these types of samples, things like this, because they weren't using the same amount of them. And so some of them were willing to donate, and they gather, look at all this stuff, for the Coalition for the Homeless. They were originally working with the Coalition for the Homeless. This student raised $515 for the Coalition for the Homeless through, you know, fundraising online. And because she really did plan, I mean, as soon as she needed to, she kind of made this move. And so she had time and she surpassed her goal. So that was a really kind of neat, you know, all of these were really creative and kind of cool ways to make it work. And then I've got more. This student, was working with the League of Women Voters. And this was you know, this was last spring. So this was pre-election. So she was working with the League of Women Voters. And then instead she created social media content. Another student, she chose to work on site, you know, she sent me quite a few pictures, but there were a lot of people in there that, you know, I didn't want to just show their picture, and showed how they were socially distanced. They were putting together the food boxes and the food bags for people to pick up when they were, you know, going to the food bank. So there was such a tremendous need. So she really wanted to do that. And so she put on her UCF mask and did it. Now this was also a very creative project because this student was also I often have students who like to work at the Coalition for the Homeless, which is great because the need is unfortunately really great. So, and it obviously relates to gender in various ways. But she was going to work for the Coalition for the Homeless, but after COVID with schools closed, she happened to have a connection to a program through her mother's job where special needs children of single parents, primarily women who were stuck at home. She basically tutored, entertained, you know, did little lessons, just kind of made phone calls and engaged them to help give parents a break, to help keep students engaged and supplement their absence from school. This was last semester. This is my organization, Animal Safe House at Brocard. And so I had Facebook that was active. I get most of my fosters through Facebook, but I didn't really have an Instagram, and this student created an Instagram for me. I had an original one when she submitted it. It was like, you know, maybe 3 or 4 followers, but I wanted to take a screenshot of it now where we have 118 followers. So now in fall 2020, we're still in pandemic mode, right? Is it ever going to end? But we are more prepared now because we already know we got this. We're almost pros. And so I get 2 incredible group examples, group projects that happen in my class. And one of them is a long-term partnership that we've established with One Body Global, very small organization who works in Ometepe, Nicaragua, which is a small and kind of isolated community where there are a lot of young women and young single mothers, and there's just a lot of need on so many levels there. So they have become connected to this community. And because the islands are made from the tops of 2 volcanoes, there are different types of rock formations and really cool things that people use to make jewelry. So there are some artisans there that make jewelry, and they used to sell it to tourists. Well, now there is not really tourism there because of COVID, and so it's impacting them. And now they've suffered from terrible hurricanes. They've just been through a really hard time in the last couple of years. So the need of these communities is extremely high. And so the woman who runs the organization now, when she goes and visits, which she just was able to go back recently, she brings back a ton of jewelry that they make. And my students created an Etsy store. They've also now created an Instagram to kind of promote it and keep it. Every semester I have students that maintain the Etsy, because there's always a student, who's savvy enough to do this. So I'll show you some screenshots and share the link of that. That's been a really incredible project. Now what they're going to do in the next semester is create more like kind of bios and promo materials and things like that, so we can just promote and help get them on a bigger scale. Because what she wants to do over there is expand the Ometepe Artisans program to where they can mentor younger women, because the women artisans, a lot of them are getting older and their hands, they're getting arthritic. We raised money and she was able to bring them Dremels, which is going to take their jewelry making next level. So that's going to be really interesting and fun to watch. And so this has been a really incredible program that is ongoing. That's all online. It's been conducted online. The meetings were online and through Zoom. And then I have another one I'm going to show you some pictures from, called the Period Project, where students raised money individually and then purchased personal hygiene products together, and got together and created hundreds of Christmas hygiene packs, which included pads and tampons and things that different people would need for, that time of the month. So the Ometepe Artisans, this is a screenshot of the Etsy store that was created, and these are some of the jewelry. Feel free to go check it out. And then this is the screenshot of the Ometepe Artisans. I haven't checked the followers on this one, actually. I'd be curious to see how many followers there are now. But Ometepe Artisans is, and they keep it updated. And what they had are bios. These are the actual artisans that are making this jewelry. And so that's that. And then I do provide a link. I don't want to spend time there because I don't know how much time, but let's see if it takes us right there. There we go, see, so it's kept pretty, and it's very affordable. So it's really neat project. This is close to my heart also because the person who runs this was a friend of mine, and her passion is really incredible, and it's very inspiring. So let me, get back to where I was. I knew there was a reason I shouldn't do that. Let's see if I can just go back. There we go. So, almost like I know what I'm doing. Their virtual collaboration, this is how another way the students say this is part of their evidence in the assignment. So it just so happens I have a lot of different examples of what they did, because they have to share this so I can evaluate their assignment. And so basically, they're even about, do you want to, email if you don't know Google Drive? How should we do this? Let's try Google Drive, let's do this, da, 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 da. And this is how they communicated. I had nothing to do with any of this, which is just the magic happened. I just assigned it. And then they had Zoom calls, and she took some screenshots of her showing her the jewelry that she had and explaining some of it. And so that was fun for everybody involved. And this one is the Period Project. I had to make this picture big because, it really is so impressive. The scale of what they did was much more than I honestly expect from a 15-hour project. But because they worked in a group, it's 15 hours for each of them. So they can do incredible things. And this is a group who really, both of these groups, and I really hope they entered the ServiceLearning showcase, I strongly encourage them to. So this was last semester. So some of the students, one of the students had written me and said, I'm a little bit concerned. I don't want to meet face to face with my classmates and they want to get together and I'm feeling I'm, immunocompromised. And I said, well, then don't do that. Absolutely not. If they want to get together, if that, they feel comfortable doing this and being masked, that's up to them, but do not do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. And so, I said, there's so many different ways you can do this without meeting with them. And so it worked for everyone, but as you see, I did see from the photos, they got together. And actually what I told her, I said, well, why don't you just have one of you go to Sam's or wherever they went, or Costco, and buy the products. You don't really have to go together, because that's kind of unnecessary for all of them. But some students, they just really want to, right now they were hungry for connection by then. It had been a long time. And so, everybody's adults, but they did it and they got together. And this is this was from the Orlando Union Rescue Mission. This was on their Instagram or their Facebook. I think it was actually Facebook. We can't thank enough Caitlin Cooks and our UCF Women's Studies group for collecting, packaging, and delivering hundreds of Christmas hygiene products for our guests at the mission. Ladies, you are a true inspiration. God bless you. This was, a proud teacher moment. I really love to see my students get that kind of recognition. And they sent other photos of people, picking them up. But of course, I didn't share them for personal, privacy reasons. So I feel like I had more, but that's the kind of basic examples, but there are still so many other ways that you can do this activism. And I have more, but I do want to stop and see if anybody has questions right now, and maybe we can open up dialogue a little early.
So we have a question, Dr. Preston, about how did you manage to inspire your students? Because, giving 15 hours a semester, it's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Is it by sharing what other students have done in the past? Is it by sharing communities that you have worked in the past? Because the examples seem to be really strong. So this person wants to know if how do you do it? How do you make that happen for the students to be excited?
Well, a lot of it is all of those ways, actually. I'm really glad you asked, because the first thing is students are often intimidated by this. And this has been something that we in Women's and Gender Studies have dealt with and taught for a long time. And at one time we had all of our courses were service learning, and all of them were 15 hours. And it was overwhelming to teach multiple classes like that, because it does require more of that energy and input. And I call it emotional energy than a non-service learning class, because some students do need a little more hand-holding, and that's okay, because it is a project many of them have never engaged in before. So what I do, part of some faculty who do these projects, they already have assignments and, a group project created, like you are going to work on this project, and then they find ways to do that. Well, what I do is I provide a list of opportunities, many of which sound kind of exciting, like, oh, this sounds kind of cool, I do that, I try to do that, so that students are already like, okay, maybe this won't be so bad. I also remind students that this is in place of, this is an assignment, it's not on top of everything else in the class. I don't have a final paper. The final paper is your reflection of the service learning project. So your project is a pretty significant part of the class. It's 30% of the grade typically, sometimes 25, but it's large portion of the class that motivates them usually. I do have students drop, and possibly could be because they see that and they don't want anything to do with it. But I really encourage students on the syllabus, in my introductory, my introduction and welcome in my online class or in my face-to-face class. I talk a lot about that, and I address their fears up front, and I address their concerns up front. And I talk as somebody who has, I was a student for a long time, and I, am a busy person, and I understand what it's like to be presented with something that just sounds overwhelming and like too much. So I put it into perspective. 15 hours over 4 months, if you plan right, it really doesn't have to be that much. It is a good amount of time, but if you plan right, it's not going to be so overwhelming in your semester, because you would spend that time doing, a 7 to 10 page research project or something. So in some of my classes that are not service learning classes, I do a creative options. I do a final research paper, but they could also do a service learning project or a creative project. I like to do that because our classes are interdisciplinary, and I have students of so many, from so many different areas doing different things. And so it allows for more creativity for the students. And I also do share a lot of examples with students. So I think just seeing the examples and thinking, oh, okay. And then once students are doing their proposals, a lot of them seem excited. And I am sharing the more effective examples. I had a lot of flops that semester, honestly, but it was only the semester that the pandemic happened, but typically, even though some of my projects may be more, impressive than others, I do have, also projects that really aren't, they're not always great.
Dr. Preston, we have some other questions.
Okay.
The period project is so inspiring. Is there a similar RSO on campus that I can join, or is that group in the PowerPoint open to accepting new members?
Well, the group in the PowerPoint, it was only a group for that semester. So what I would encourage you to do is either if you are already connected to a group in any way, you could propose this, because what some students have done in collecting period products, they've done it for trans and non-binary folks who may not be as confident buying certain things, or making it available, especially to low-income people who may not have access to these things but still need them. So there are a lot of different communities that you can target with these types of drives. But really there is actually an organization on campus, now that you say that. You just set off a light bulb. So I'm glad you asked. I'm going to look it up real quick. And I believe that UCF does now have an organization on campus that does this. So
there is.
I will.
UCF, if anyone is curious. And
Is
I believe, yeah, I think it's just called Period UCF.
Okay, cool. The period. Yeah, this one says the period project. So I would look up the period project UCF, and if I find the link, I'll share it. Or if anybody does, please share it, because I forgot about that. So there is a group actually that you could join and do things like this. Because period poverty, what people call it, period poverty, it is a term now that's used, is, in homeless communities, in all types of communities, low-income communities, trans and non-binary communities, for different reasons, this is an issue. So it is, if you have to buy these things, they're not inexpensive.
Yeah, there is on Instagram at period.ucf. We do have another question. As a student, how do you build a relationship with an organization so you can continue to volunteer with them after the semester is over?
Usually, that's a good question too. Usually you have built it through the project, even just through that communication. A lot of students work on their own, not in groups, so they may reach out individually or fill out an application individually, and then they establish a relationship. If you are working in a group and one of your group leaders takes on that role, and then you feel like you don't have that connection, I'd say you write them directly and say, I worked with this group, we did this. The fact that you've already done something for them already establishes a good relationship. But if you happen to want to do something and you're not in a class, the first thing I tell people to do is look at their website, look what is the process. Some organizations have you fill out the application. Some have background checks depending on what you're trying to do. Some have their wish lists online that you can just, for, let's say, for the holidays, put together a community drive, or in your, if you're in a dorm, or if you're at a job. things like that. There's a lot of different ways that you can, serve these organizations and then establish those relationships in that way. But don't be afraid to write somebody, don't write somebody on, just blindly, go look at their organization. What do they do? What do they need, kind of things. And then, either write them with an idea or write with interest. They often have volunteer coordinators. That's what they do. So that's who you want to try to find first.
We have another question on, this one is on the ServiceLearning Showcase.
Okay.
We're asking for more information if this is something in the fall or the spring term. And
both terms now. We have had some changes to it because of our director. The director changed, but let me look up the dates because and actually at the end of this presentation, which I will share, there is a link to experiential learning, and that's where the showcase is hosted through. And so you can find the application, because the way it works is you fill out an application to present, and you or your group present your project, and faculty and staff judge it, and then you can win a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money, thousands of dollars. And I am telling you that because, and me and Dr. Santana as well have been judges. And there are many incredible projects, but a lot of people win. So let me just pull up the dates. So if you look at the, it's still during the fall and spring semester. And there's a link for students if you go to exp.learning.ucf.edu, and then it's got the 2021 Amy Zay Service Learning Showcase. And this year it's hosted virtually. I don't know if it will be next year. The application deadline is actually March 22nd. So if you already got a project that you've done and you hustle, you can still submit. So I'm actually glad we're doing it before the deadline. But if you can't, you can also do it next semester.
Dr. Preston, we have another question. For someone who isn't involved in a service learning class, but still wants to be an activist, are there more casual ways to do this? Can we stick to one organization, or can you try to volunteer at multiple organizations?
Hold on, I'm sorry. Let me get my dog real quick. Sorry, I knew this would happen, but they've taken over. Let me go put her outside. Okay. So
the question,
you can volunteer at more than one organization, and some of the students even in these classes do break their hours up. But if you're not, so the question is, if you're not in a service learning organization, the ways to become involved in, is that what it was? I'm so sorry that I got interrupted.
it says that they're not involved in a service learning class, but still want to be an activist. Are there more casual ways to do this? Should we stick
Oh, yes.
to an organization, or can we try to volunteer at multiple organizations?
I would encourage you to try to volunteer at as many organizations as you would like until you find something that sticks. You're not really gonna know what, unless if you're not an activist now, and you're not really gonna know what's going to give you that, fulfillment or what you're looking for until you're doing it. And so I would say to just kind of go for it, start thinking about what you're passionate about, think about what organizations do that, what needs there are in the community you may want to meet. And there are a lot of casual ways. You can do things, very kind of simple, like smaller scale things, like just getting involved, in small ways, like starting, doing the online petitions and doing things like that, collecting your own goods for an organization or something like that before you maybe do something on a whole community scale. You may want to just kind of put your toes in the water in that way, or you may want to just go ahead and say, hey, I'm gonna put a box outside of my clubhouse and start collecting things for this. Or you may fill out an online application and see what happens, see what the organization needs. Almost all of my students who do these projects, I would say that the vast majority of them have never done anything like this before.
Dr. Preston, we have another question. Can you explain the procedure of service learning within a semester? You mentioned 15 hours. And also the second part of the question is, what happens if I start a project with an organization and it falls through?
Well, that does happen, unfortunately. And I do tell students that pitfalls and things fall through, that is part of the process. And that's usually something that if you're in a class, the faculty, the professor has already taken into consideration, you know, a backup plan. I usually have students kind of just try to pick up something else. I'll often have groups involved in other projects that I kind of will say maybe they need help, you know, so that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. But for the most part, the way it works is I will say for what I do, and this is just my class, but I think others do it in similar ways. So I have a proposal. I give them the list of all the options. I give them the assignment sheet. What is all the reflection, everything that's going to be required so they can wrap their head around it and start thinking about it right at the beginning of the semester. And then by maybe week 3 or 4, I have them turn in the proposal. So you are forced to have your project at least imagined by then. And then you still got like 4 good months, right? No, well, you've still got at least 3.5, 4 months, depending on, you know, the timing, to get this project done. Sometimes I do mid-semester check-ins. I do different things so that they're doing, sometimes during different modules, I'll connect it to a service learning. And so I kind of try to integrate it as much as possible into the course. Not always as good as I would like, but, and what I do, like I said earlier, is I make it a big part of the grade. The service learning proposal is in place of a module. So it's not like, oh, you're doing your module this week and you're doing a service learning proposal. You know, it's like the module this week is reading about activism and the women's movement and then doing your proposal. So I really try to make it, you know, work that way. And I think I'm pretty confident a lot of faculty do the same thing. So, and then your final paper is your reflection and you get to show off all the activism that you've done. I also allow students to do 3 things. They can either write like a more conventional reflection paper that I have an assignment for. They can do a creative presentation of their project, or they can enter the service learning and create their poster for the service learning project. Showcase. And that's another way I kind of get them to do it, because I find I have much fewer students enter that showcase than they should, because it's a great opportunity and they've already done the work. So now I've started letting them do that for their final reflection. So that's just my approach.
We have a couple of more questions. We have 3 more. Do you know of any service organizations that would benefit from volunteers with backgrounds in Excel and other statistical software?
Oh my gosh, I have a feeling that that's a skill that a lot of organizations could benefit from. Now, it depends on the scale of the organization if they already have somebody in that position. And so I would be more willing to look for kind of smaller organizations around, you know, and you can usually tell that by looking online. Sorry. They almost made it. Let me go let them out. Okay, I'll be right back.
We're watching Dr. Leandra Preston, Senior Lecturer of the Women and Gender Studies program, in our first event celebrating Women's History Month in 2021. Dr. Preston, another question. The student is wondering if you have worked with Knights Pantry in campus.
I do have quite a few students who work with Knights Pantry, and that is a great option. In my classes, I have different, depending on the class. I mean, most often it's Intro to Women's Studies, but I do have other classes that students do service learning in. So depending on the class, there are different ways to make this relevant and connect, but I often have a student or 2 each semester work with Knights Pantry, so absolutely yes. And what I like to do is when I have a student, you know, give them all these options and put these on this list, which I mean, it's not as comprehensive as it should be ever. And then if students are in another community and they work with that, you know, add that to the list, because I may have students who live in Daytona. So now I have organizations in Daytona. You know, we have organizations that kind of, and it just grows. And where you live may, I mean, especially if you're in an online class, I have no idea what's there, but you know, and so you can tap into those opportunities and, you know, needs, and just kind of keep your eyes open and look for them.
And this is an interesting question coming from a student. What kind of activism did students do in service learning before the pandemic?
Oh, well, some of them were similar projects, because I teach online, and I always pretend that I have one student in another country, one student who can't leave the house, because it kind of covers, you know, allowing the students who are taking online classes to complete all of the projects in the class. So more students, as you saw from the few examples that, you know, started their project before the pandemic, were doing some conventional things like volunteering at the Coalition for the Homeless, or, you know, helping host or volunteer at, let's say, a walk for a domestic violence shelter. There was a pause for domestic violence, and the pet in domestic violence issue. It was to raise awareness and money. And there was a walk, so students would, you know, work things like that. And a lot of students try to connect with domestic violence shelters, but it depends on if they have time and the desire to complete the background checks and things like that. Because if they want to start getting involved with that, it does require a little more time, and sometimes even a cost, which isn't required for the service learning, but it's required if that's what you're choosing to do for your project. So that's often students who may be interested in those fields and want to get into that. And so then, you know, they maybe were working at a shelter in that capacity. Some students have done things like, you know, still the creative projects. I always have creative projects. Days for Girls has been a partnership that we've done where people make the supplies for girls. I want to show you a photo actually of, let me make it a little bit bigger. It's not really that big, but I have, is my screen? Okay, there we are. See this photo? This is this is a Days for Girls. What they have are sites in different cities, like this is in Orlando, where people would get together, not with pre-pandemic, they just didn't have masks on, but they get together and there's a bunch of there's sewing circles, and they create these things for the hygiene kits. And then for the people who maybe can't sew, they put together all the supplies for the hygiene kits. And so what was happening during the pandemic was people were doing this stuff at home, putting together their own kits, whereas pre-pandemic, they may be in a more open community sharing and doing this stuff with other people. This student was doing it post-pandemic, where they resumed the meetings and they were doing them just, you know, social distance and mask for the most part. And so a lot of the things students were doing were very similar to the things they're doing now, just with a little less on-site work, I would say. What I put together was a long list of kind of, I'll go through since you asked. So I'm going to go through a few examples what students have done. This was because a lot of this would be pre or post pandemics, just how they're doing it. And so this one, it worked with the Lakeland Volunteers in Medicine, and they focused on the pink tax because they tax hygiene products like tampons and pads. And so they have been trying to eliminate this tax for a really long time. And so this was what the Lakeland Volunteers in Medicine were doing that and collecting feminine hygiene products to donate to low-income patients. So instead of a virtual walk, maybe students would do a real walk to raise awareness about and funds for Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And then I have a zine, a blog. I keep zine blogs. I have, sometimes it just, they collect, and during the pandemic, allowed a couple students to do that for the blog. So blogging, I have various blogs. I got creative and allowed them to do some of these other opportunities, but these are still activist things, you know, regardless of pandemic or not. So the UCF period project, there it is. And then there's so many. I mean, I can share this list too. So her campus, UCF. This student published 2 articles on lack of quality representation to her campus, UCF, and it created a really cool visual presentation that got published. That was really neat. She did it, you know, not as part of anything else, just for the project. So period product drive for Immokalee farm workers, worked with the UCF period project. So there's so many different things that students do, but like a woman letter writing to women registered voters to, you know, talk about voting, encourage them to vote. Clothing center at the Women's Center of Brevard, but I have a lot of students who have worked on site at the Women's Center for Brevard.
We have 5 more minutes, Dr. Preston, but there's a final question that just came in, and that is, why is it important to do service learning in a women and gender studies program course? And you have
so glad. I'm so glad you asked that question, because we talk so much about raising awareness about these issues, right? We encourage students to think critically about these structures and these larger structures and these, you know, oppressive structures and these communities that, you know, maybe are marginalized. And we basically raise awareness about all of this. And so it's kind of unfair to not show you and encourage you to do something about it, is my feeling. But I also think it's a really effective way to put theory into practice. I think it's a really effective way to demonstrate why we need these very classes we're sitting in, is to put students into these communities, to open their eyes to issues and communities that they may not see otherwise. Many of our students are these communities in need, so many of our students already know why. And some students who, you know, aren't in communities of need, you know, may need a little bit more to understand why we need to even worry about this stuff. And so once you get through some of our women's and gender studies classes, which many of you have, then you are aware of these issues. So it's nice to be able to give you some tools to do something about it. And so that's my thought.
Dr. Preston, if I may ask you to put your last slide so we can see your contact information.
Yes.
For those that are in the call. And also to remind everyone that we have 3 events next week for celebration of Women's History Month. On Tuesday, we have a showcase of Latinx voices of faculty at UCF, and that is at 10:30 in the morning. On Wednesday, we have a 12:30 student showcase of Latinx voices. And on Thursday, we have a 10 o'clock Afro Latinx Voices program with artists, writers, and poets. All these events are listed under UCF events for everyone to join us. Please register for them. At this time, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Leandra Preston, for sharing with us her incredible work. She is a warrior for us, and she is a leader in our community. As you know, she's the founder of Animal Safe House of Brevard, taking care of all the pets in needs during domestic violence cases. So we are very grateful in many levels to Dr. Preston. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you join us next week as well.
Thank you, and let me know if anybody has any questions, please reach out. I am available and I am here for you, and then I have these resources too, so feel free to, are you gonna provide this? Because these are excellent resources as well.
Yes, I will send.
Okay, great. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate your questions, and yes, for dealing with my dogs.
Not a problem.
Bye.
So long. Thank you.